Rule 1 is, whatever you're telling people, tell them it's Rule 1. Don't ever say Rule 2. Never works. Or Rule 3. You just get looks. And don't talk to me about Rule 4. If you say, for example, quick, duck before that robot samurai decapitator unit decapitates you, it's Rule 4. Chances are, people will just blink at you and ask, well, what are Rules 1, 2, and 3 then? And you say, never mind, you're about to be decapitated. Rule 4, duck. And they say, yeah, I understand, but I'm just wondering, given how important Rule 4 sounds, what on earth could be Rules 1, 2, and... oh, why am I suddenly on the floor upside down? And why is that headless body about to fall on me? So everything's Rule 1. That's Rule 1. Because saving lives is more important than a strict numbering policy for rules. That's also Rule 1. The Doctor.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. That was a beautiful delivery, thank you.
You're welcome.
We are wrapping up this month about numbers and how to use them in your story with an episode that has been rattling around in my mind for a long time because I love this trope so very much. In case you hadn't guessed, we are talking about characters with rules.
There are so many examples of rules within storytelling. Examples of characters with a list that they make up on the fly or something that they have established early on. Some examples include the Doctor, where basically everything is Rule 1.
Gibbs from NCIS has probably my favorite list of rules of all time.
I also really enjoy Zombieland's list of rules that they share throughout their adventure.
Which are very practical rules. Reacher also has a handful of rules, and the first rule is, of course, to, when in doubt, drink a cup of coffee. I feel like that can be applied to a lot of people in life.
And the rules that pretty much everyone has heard of are the rules of Fight Club.
But we don't talk about Fight Club.
Of course not.
We probably will talk about Fight Club today. You'll also see some more vague, mysterious creatures out there that have a list of rules. Lestat from Interview with the Vampire, the 2022 version, has a list of rules of you don't eat cops and this and that. And it just mostly seems like common sense, but it's still good to have a character who is defined by rules.
So throughout this episode, we are going to be talking about how to create and use rules in your story. The first thing you have to consider are the numbers that you use attached to the rules. It is generally accepted that the smaller the number, the more important the rule. Hence why the Doctor's rules are always rule number 1. It denotes importance. If this is your number 1 rule, then it has a lot of weight, a lot of importance, and it's something you really need to listen to and follow.
If it's not rule number 1, you'll find these starting to align with some of the other numbers that we've talked about this month. So if it's rule number 13, it's going to be one of the darker, scarier, more ominous type rules. Whereas number 4 is based around types of people, these kinds of things. You'll start to see these other numbers that we talked about leak in to these rules in some way.
The other thing is you don't necessarily have to share these rules in order. You don't have to tell them or number them in order. If you look at Zombieland, for example, it starts out in order. Rule 1, cardio. Rule 2, double tap, which I feel is so very appropriate for Rule 2. Rule 3, beware of bathrooms. And then suddenly, Rule 17, don't be a hero. Also Rule 17, be a hero.
So having other numbers besides just the ones that you have listed can be a great way to make it feel like the list is full, even if we don't have to hear what rule number 16 is or whatever. I believe Gibbs has almost 100 rules, and we see maybe 30 of them listed throughout the series of NCIS.
Another common number that you will see as a rule is the rule 0, or the 0th rule, that generally comes down to don't argue with me.
This is especially popular in tabletop gaming, and DMs like to pull this one out of the hat. Well, the rule book says, actually, push up my glasses kind of character around the table. The DM can say, it also says, DM is king, don't argue with me. That is the 0th rule that supersedes even the first rules in the book.
Even if you look at things like Sanderson's rules of storytelling, the 0th law is err on the side of awesome. This rule is just we do it because we can. I say it is, so it is. And it's just cool, so get over it.
You'll also see in tabletop gaming, you'll see this interpreted as don't give the DM ideas, or sometimes choose the more fun interpretation of the rule. So if this rule could be applied this way, could be applied that way, we're just going with the fun one because we're here to have fun. We're here to be entertained. Whatever it is that your character is there to do, the 0th rule that may or may not actually exist would be don't die if they're in Zombieland or whatever. Whatever the character's massive, overarching, super broad goal is, your 0th rule is probably going to be that thing.
You will also commonly see a lack of rules when there are rules. It's the times where the only rule is there are no rules.
So here's what we do. We make the plan, we execute the plan, expect the plan to go off the rails, throw away the plan, and just go for it. The characters that have just the one rule of stop playing by the rules tend to be the ones who are plot catalysts and the ones who drive your main character to act, to do something. This is especially common if you have a character who is shy, who is unsure of themselves. They are more likely to stay back if they're that Hufflepuff character. The character that has only one rule, which is there are no rules, is the opposite and manages to push your main character forward into the story.
It's a really good contrast to a character that has a lot of rules, and they help to kind of balance each other out. Another common thing that you'll see is the repetition of rule number 1. A character like, for instance, the Doctor, where there's always a rule number 1, and the rule number 1 changes depending on the scenario.
One of the quotes that I found that we didn't end up using today was from a movie called The Chase. Rule number 1 is no loud screaming. I thought rule number 1 was no burning the guy with a gun. Well, now you're being a little too feisty for your own good. Okay, rule number 2 is no loud screaming. You'll also see this used as almost a catchphrase for your main character, where rule number 1 is, and then they just say something completely different every time. So the point of codifying the rules and giving them numbers is completely moot with this particular character. They're just trying to make it sound like they're being important, which is kind of like what we had at the opener today.
And it really goes to the reason they keep saying it's rule 1 is because in the moment they want it to seem like the most important thing that this person could do or follow without creating any, well, what's rule 2, 3 if you're giving me rule 4 right now? So if there's that urgency, resorting back to rule 1 is always a great idea.
And having a character use these as part of their personality can make the characters so potent and so lovable when they are otherwise just kind of generic. Like, Gibbs has a lot of great personality traits to him, but one of the main things that I remember about this character are the rules. And everyone knows you have to follow those rules. So when you're designing a character with these rules, there are a couple of things to keep in mind.
First and foremost, the characters have had some kind of life experiences. There are things that have happened to them that have lent to creating these rules. You can't tell me Gibbs didn't include never involve a lawyer arbitrarily. There was a reason all of these rules have been created.
I especially love when characters who don't have rules are talking about the character with the rules. It's like, why is his 14th rule to always keep a jar of honey on you? What is he planning? What is he up to? What's the backstory there? And have these characters interact and guess about this mysterious character can be a lot of fun.
And it's a really fun way to integrate all of that backstory in there and making sure you're including all of those life experiences in some way without having to do exposition dumps on them. And something to consider, the most likely character to have these rules that are established based on those life experiences is going to be your older character, your mentor character, because they've had the experience in order to develop rules, and they are teaching those rules to the younger generation.
The other side of that is you'll see these characters who are lone wolves develop rules. Characters like Dexter have a very particular set of rules that they follow in order to continue to survive. You'll see this when the character is going to make a decision, especially you see this in like Reacher, where he wants to decide if he wants to get involved or not. One of the rules is never volunteer for anything, so he steps away from the confrontation. And then, of course, he gets pulled in because it would be a boring story if he just walked away from all the conflicts. But having this character with these rules tells us not only about the character, but helps us understand their thought process when they are approaching a decision.
And overall, you want this character to have developed these rules on their own, through their own experience, through things that they've learned. It is a complete set that they have created, not something that they have gotten from someone else. They may have picked up a few pieces of rules from other people over their time, maybe their own mentor, but they're not following someone else's list of rules.
Yeah, you'll see them say Gibbs's rule number 9, always carry a knife. You'll see them referencing another character's rules, but it'll be with their name attached to it. Of this character says this thing, so we can then repeat it. If it's some other rules that someone once upon a time listed out and wrote down, and now we just know these rules, then that character ends up being more of a bureaucrat that's just regurgitating other people's rules instead of building their own. They're a lot less likable without a character attached to the rules.
So as fun as creating all of these arbitrary rules can be within your story, there has to be a purpose behind it. You can't just say, well, I want to have this character do this thing because it's fun. You need to have some in-world explanation for why they are doing that. So let's talk about how to use this within storytelling. Like Lee just mentioned, often you'll have other characters reference the numbered rules as much as the character with the rules. Like Gibbs, where all the people who are learning from him know and understand all of his rules. Like the Doctor, where everybody knows his rule number 1 is whatever he feels like in the moment.
You'll also see this as a voiceover style narrative of let me introduce you to the world. Something like Zombieland, where we're familiar with the tropes overall, but we're taking a sort of comedic twist on it. So having those rules listed right off the bat tell us not only that the character has experience dealing with zombies, but he has an organized way of going about it. So you'll have a character telling the reader, or possibly the viewer in the case of film, that these are the rules and this is how I've survived this long.
If you want to introduce the rules somewhere kind of in the middle of the story, you will need to introduce them in a way to help influence the point of view character towards a decision. Like in Reacher, he will state the rule in the middle of the book to help influence someone around him who is trying to make a decision, or influence himself in making that decision.
So rule number 5 is show them who they're messing with. That tells us that this character is about to make a decision that includes violence. And we as readers always cheer. We know he's about to obliterate the bad guys. He's making that decision by referencing the rule.
And honestly, your characters are not going to follow these rules 100% all of the time. You have to expect these rules are going to be broken, and that there will be consequences for when that happens.
This is sometimes done by the character with the rules, where they are learning and they are growing themselves. And sometimes it's the student character breaking the mentor character's rules and then learning the hard way why this is a rule in the first place. In the first case, you'll see something like Gibbs going, rule number 1, never let suspects sit together. When that rule is introduced, we already know that that rule is going to be broken sometime this episode.
But throughout the season, all of these rules are going to be introduced, they're going to be broken, and often they're going to come into play in the finale somehow. They are going to show how these characters have improved from where they were before. And you can do the same thing within your story. You introduce these rules early on, midway, they get broken, chaos happens, but in the end, all of it comes back full circle. And it can really help you create that nice closed loop of storytelling.
Sometimes you'll see a character use these rules in order to make a point. Something like Fight Club, where rule number 1 is you don't talk about Fight Club. Can you guess what rule number 2 is? You don't talk about Fight Club. So having more than one rule that says more or less exactly the same thing is a way to make sure that this point is driven home to your characters and to your readers of this is really important. It's not just that it's rule number 1, but it's also repeated.
If you look at Gibbs's rule 11 versus his 91, you can see that they're very similar. And that's largely because 91 is an updated version of 11.
So having a character that can update rules can be super helpful in making these characters feel real, feel human, and not necessarily religious. And I don't mean that in a faith-based way, but I mean these are the rules and nothing will ever change and you have to follow these without questioning. It's much more of they're learning, they're growing, and the rules are adapting, the rules are changing because the character with the rules is changing.
It's a nice way to show character progression on all sides. Whether it is the student character learning by breaking a rule and saying, oh, that's why it exists, or the mentor character saying, okay, it's time to change this, to update, to have a new version because this old one no longer applies. This old one is out of date for whatever reason.
You will often see this with the genie and the 3 rules of, okay, the rules are you can't wish for more wishes. That was added on because someone tried it. The rules are you can't make anybody fall in love with anybody else. And the rules are don't bring people back from the dead. All of these are things that we know the character has updated at certain points. And then if you wish for something that's absurd and off the wall, the genie might add a 4th rule and go, you know what? The 4th rule is you're not allowed to wish for dogs to all speak in a Scottish accent because that's just weird.
So as you're considering your own story and the ability to use rules, consider what would your main character's rules be?
Well, my character is too chaotic and doesn't like rules at all, and they're just so fun and off the wall.
Then they could be something closer to the Doctor, where they just make up a rule in the moment because they need somebody to listen. They need somebody to think that this is a very important thing they're going to do. So everything is always rule number 1. Or they can just make up things off the bat. Rule 58, Rule 13, just for funsies.
You will also see the more chaotic characters do this subconsciously, where they've learned from an experience and now they know they're never going to eat the purple flowers. Even if it's a completely different plant, purple flowers are no longer an option. They don't necessarily number the rules, but it's still in there somewhere. So as an exercise as an author, it might be an interesting thing if you're having trouble connecting with the character. Figure out the rules that they operate by. Your character doesn't have to name them or number them or anything like what we've talked about today, but understanding their rules and how they make decisions can really help strengthen your relationship with the character and make them feel more realistic, more powerful. The same thing is true of your mentor character. If your mentor character is feeling very generic, consider giving them a set of rules, something that the fans can latch onto and regurgitate, and Wizard's first rule is that people are stupid. I've said that my entire life. I haven't even read the book, but I had a friend who said it. It's a great rule and a good one to keep in mind as you're going throughout life. Having these rules are super helpful in making the character stand out without necessarily changing the role or how they make decisions in your story.
And it can really help you figure out their backstory, figure out who they are, why they would have those rules in the first place, without having to go into the intricacies of detailing their entire backstory. You just look at this character at this point in their life. What would they have learned by now? What sort of things would they have established as their own rules for how they go throughout life? Are they the kind of character that would always say, always have a knife?
Which is, again, just a good rule of thumb.
Knives are useful.
They are. So, if you're having trouble connecting with a character, write down their rules, maybe even include them on the page, especially if you're a pantser. You can take them out later, not a big deal. But I think you'll fall in love with this trope in a way that will enrich your story without changing it. So I advise you to at least experiment with your rule. And then rule number 1 is to
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.